discover yourself, find out who you are, meet the new you. What does it mean when we say all of this? How is one or where is one to discover themselves? Are we supposed to find ourselves in the already established pattern that we have going on, in the same routine, in the same familiar circle pattern that we exist in? Are we supposed to find ourselves within that boundary? Are we supposed to discover ourselves in that pre-established patterns that we see in front of us? And then how does it look like when we do think that we have found ourselves? We begin to say that we are this type of a person and we are not this type of a person. We begin to identify with habits, certain practices that we may have developed as a result of finding ourselves within that pattern. Is that the quality of discovery that we were looking for? We begin to say that we are a morning person, or I am a night person. We would say that I am a tea kind of guy, or I am a coffee person. Is that how we discover ourselves in this smaller meaningless practices, habits? Would this discovery hold any significance when we say I enjoy one type of a surrounding than the other type of a surrounding? Does that hold any value? Does that discovery that we have done for ourselves has any real ground, or we have just randomly settled into conclusions that we find in our immediate surroundings? I prefer one color over the other. I prefer one type of clothing over another kind of clothing. I prefer one kind of work over this different kind of work that I have in front of me. Is that our understanding when we are faced with this question of finding ourselves? And what are the parameters that we lay in front of us when we say that we are supposed to find ourselves? When we say that I prefer this type of a travel destination over that type of a travel destination, I prefer flying over trains. Does all of these random choices, preferences matter in our self discovery, or there is something much more significant, deeper, meaningful to this process of self discovery? Have we reduced finding ourselves to finding our likes and dislikes? Would our likes and dislike make up our sense of self? Is our sense of self derived by the things that we find in our environment, or is it through our actions, behavior, and how we carry ourselves? Who I am is more clearer when I am with myself, when I find myself among other people, when I find myself at a public place in a queue, when I find myself stopped at a traffic light. This is where I find myself in these situations, and how I react and respond to this situation is who I am. If I am angry, if I am irritated, if I have no patience, then that is who I am. We distance ourselves from the facts that lie in front of us, that manifests itself in our actions, in our reactions towards the thing, and there is a different picture of who we are in our head that we carry, And when things do not, and when our reactions and actions do not match that picture, we begin to say that this was just a one off, that this just happened. The fact is that who we are was just revealed to us, and when we are faced with that revelation, we conveniently deny it, but in that denial lies our tendency to not really discover ourselves, to not really find out who we are. Because in these situations, uh, in the times of conflict, in the times of distress, is when our real self really shows itself up. And if we are denying it, we are denying our factuality. We may have an idea of who we are in our head, but that idea does not concur with the fact of our behavior and reaction when we find ourselves in a conflict. Upon facing our real self, our reality in the mirror, we simply were displeased with it. Rather, that reality, that fact that is just showed to us by that situation, rather than treating it as an insight, we treat it as something dirty, something to be pushed under the carpet, something that is not who we are. Upon faced with our reality, with the fact of who we are, all sorts of rationale we give of how that fact is not a part of our identity. All of this rational logic that we then begin to give ourselves is just a practice in building our ignorance towards ourselves. A so-called positive picture in our head is met with another so-called negative picture in our head. We tend to go by the lens of this positive and negative that we have, and then judge and conclude the matter without letting the discovery that we just stumbled upon arise a sense of, give birth to a sense of understanding within us, which is complete, which gives a peek into our reality. After all, we have evolved from animals, and there ought to be a certain impatience, a certain violent hatred, angst, the tendency to possess. All of that would be in our DNA, in the very fabric of our structure. And when it shows itself up in the situations of conflict, instead of addressing it and looking at it directly, to dismiss and deny it as a mistake is a disservice that we are doing to ourselves. We are too taken aback by what we have just witnessed about ourselves, and so that shock, that surprise, a rather unpleasant surprise about ourselves, does not let us see firsthand the shoddiness, the pettiness of our inward structure. We may think of ourselves as someone kind, someone loving, someone compassionate, but when we see that that's not the case, that we are not kind, we are not just loving in ourselves, that we are not compassionate inwardly, we do not like it because it clashes with the image that we have in our head. To call our reality ugly, not nice, and not pleasant to see is to not understand the truth of it, is to not face it directly, is to paint it with a certain image that we have, and when we do that, we do not understand it. And to stay with it, to see really for ourselves that wow, all of this that shows up when we find ourselves in a situation of conflict is who we really are. And to see it is to not to oblige to it, to understand it directly. Our reality is for that thing to now lose its grip on it, to lose its grip on ourselves. As long as our pettiness, as long as our shoddiness has its grip on us, we begin to validate it by denying it, by not seeing it for what it is. To see it for what it is to unvalidate it, is to be free of the compulsion of identifying with it. This is our reality, but that doesn't mean that this is it. It is not the final thing. To see our reality firsthand, to see, to be in its direct contact, to see it face to face and not call it ugly and not call it not nice, is to transform that very thing. To be with it, to understand it, transforms it. It is not as if this ugliness is the final thing, that it is crystallized in itself. To look at it is to change it, and to look at it without the intention of changing it, but the looking itself means the transformation of it without the intent of changing it. The looking alone, the seeing alone changes the thing. Our fear of confrontation with the other is actually rooted in the fear of confrontation with our own reality. When one does not when one does not confront their own facts, their own inward mess that they have created for themselves, they naturally go on to avoid confrontation with the other also. When we avoid ourselves and avoid facing our own reality, we also avoid facing the reality that exists in the relationship that we have, that we share with the other. This aversion to confrontation comes from the aversion of confronting our own self, however petty or however miserable that may be. To not confront it, to not see it face to face, is to make it more powerful, is to give it more strength. Is when we see it, it loses its grip on us. It's when we confront it, it stops to be that overwhelming that we think it to be. The further we run away from the reality, the more speed we provide our reality to follow us, the more strength we provide our reality to dominate us. And that reality is not the final thing. It will change, because the movement of life is founded upon change. It changes. It is a living thing. A living thing is not stationary. It is not crystallized. It moves. And when we see our reality, it changes its form. It is not as if it is a thing that will overpower us, dominate us, and then we would be left helpless. It just appears to be so. It appears dominating. It appears in our imagination that it will overpower us. But that's not the case. All of it is our imagination about the reality. Without confronting, we make images of how that confrontation will be. And so we begin to rely on distractions. We begin to devise means and methods that would take us away from this very daunting, overwhelming thing that looms over our head. And so in escaping from it, we further strengthen it, and then we are caught up in this cycle, in this vicious feedback loop which we have created for ourselves. And so in a funny way, the ghost that we run away from is our own creation. And if we have created the ghost, we certainly hold within us the power to chase it away. If we have validated its existence, we can invalidate its existence too. So to discover oneself, to find out who we are, is to see for the first time our faces in the mirror. We externally see ourselves in the mirror every day, but when we finally come face to face with our own reality, there is relief in that. The running away stops. It is as though we take our first breath It is as though we finally see what beauty really is. Then all the things around us change because the change has happened within. The relationship with the things outside is dictated by the health within. And when there is real health within, you appreciate that is without. Everything around us then becomes alive, as if that we are it is as if that we are seeing it for the first time. It is as if we have finally felt how air feels against our skin. It is then when you see what the sorrow of the other is, because the sorrow of the other is your sorrow too, because the pain that the other goes through is the pain that you also carry within, and it is not different. We may operate with the imaginary line of separation that we have created with the environment or with the other, but when you really understand the unity of yourself as against to your environment and with the other, you see all the difference begins to cease. In some sense, the otherness vanishes. So when it is said that you remain the same in happiness or in sadness, that the two doesn't bother the wise, that in happiness the wise is not flippantly alleviated, or in their sadness they are not pitifully sad and depressed. It is not that one resigns from the experiences of the either or, but there is that certain quality of depth which in sorrow and in joy is the same. It is that common point which is the source of all joyfulness, and it is the same point through which you see the sorrow of the other. And there is a certain fullness, there is a certain completeness in that sorrow that is absent in the narrowness of individual sorrow. In that narrowness there is that happiness and there is that sadness, but because it is narrow, neither the happiness, the flippant happiness, or the pitiful sadness has any ground, has any real validation. But when there is that depth of understanding, from that point one is joyful, and from that same point one is in deep sorrow, because you see everything around you, because there is no real difference between the other and the you. And in that point only life that has its own force manifests itself, because life is all that. And when we devoid ourselves of that depth, of that understanding, we are devoiding ourselves from that fullness, from that completeness that life has to offer us.